I'm a little cut off on the top, right?
There we go.
How's that? Okay. Better?
Let me just...
Now I feel like I'm being interrogated by a Nazi webcam. Nice lights.
Sorry.
I'm disappointed that it's a Netherlands audience, but not everyone is sitting in the on bikes. Sorry, go ahead.
Can you hear me well?
I can hear you just fine. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah, let me just turn up the volume a bit. Okay, well, great. This is perfect. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Stefan Molyneux from Canada. It works straight away. Okay, you can see me too.
Oh, that's it for the intro, like that?
Okay. So it's more personal like this, right?
If you want.
Perfect. Okay, well, Stefan, you have like 40 minutes more or less. Let's see if Tuur joins too, but otherwise we'll just do it together. So if you could give us your amazing story the first 20 minutes or so, and then we can open up for the audience. Because the audience really likes to ask questions, so if you can take that into account, then we can start straight away.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but it's fantastic to see so many people out there enjoying and being curious about and explaining the Bitcoin experience. So you know that there are speakers who are going to come to a gathering like this and give you the rousing speech designed to make you wildly enthusiastic, charge the ramparts of entrenched financial interests, and bite the heads off anyone who stands in your way. I'm not going to be that speaker. I've done that before, and I strongly believe in it, but I think that there's another side to the Bitcoin future that really, really needs to be explored. And that basically is recognizing the size, economic strength, and political power of the entrenched interests that Bitcoin directly threatens. And I just wanted to go over a few facts about that. Which is to say we should continue to do what we're doing, which is, I think, to spread horizontally through the economy, but recognize that at some point there is going to be a conflict of biblical proportions between decentralized, encrypted currency mechanisms and dispute resolution third-party trust mechanisms and the entrenched financial interests. So just a few days ago, the Bank of England has sounded off or weighed in on the issue of Bitcoin. And this is what they say. Digital currencies such as Bitcoin could threaten the economy if they become widespread, the Bank of England warned. In the most extreme case, Bitcoin's decentralized payment system and finite supply could make central banks obsolete. Should we take a moment to mourn their passing? They could also create huge economic risks, and as you well know, I'm sure this audience more than most, risks is just a synonym for opportunity. And Bitcoin and related currencies could trigger deflation. Deflation. You ever heard this bugaboo? It's just supposed to scare people because they don't want to use lowered prices, because lowered prices is actually quite a good thing, but they say deflation. Now, why is deflation considered to be such a bad thing? I mean, if you go to the petrol pump and the price is lower, you're like, yay! And the price of computers and software and related hardware is all going down. We are paying virtually nothing. You have this call, whereas I remember having a long-distance relationship with a girlfriend in the 90s and basically having to give up half a kidney to the phone company for long-distance calls. Now you get, two-way high-quality audio-video pretty much for free. So what is the problem with deflation? Well, deflation fundamentally is a problem for governments, not for private citizens. I'm not sure this is the very first time in history where the interests of governments and the interests of private citizens have not perfectly coincided. I'll have to think of if there are any other examples. Maybe you can help me out in the Q&A period. But what's the problem with deflation? Well, deflation lowers prices. Lowered prices put downward pressure on wages, means less tax revenue. And of course, if you've ever faced a government union saying that you need to lower their wages, not really the first thing on the politicians' happy-go-go, joy-joy juice agenda for the morning. They really don't do that. And there's a lot of other reasons, but governments dislike lowering the prices, whereas private citizens really like it. The other thing they say is, well, if prices are going down, in other words, if your money is becoming more valuable by you not spending it, and they say, well, people will hoard their money. Like, that's a really bad thing. But that's ridiculous. I mean, if you hoard money, so what? It just means that there's less of the environment destroyed through useless consumerism. I can't think that that's a terribly bad thing. And banks, which used to only sit on a couple of $1 billion of reserves, are now sitting on over $1 trillion of reserves. They're not lending it to anyone, and you don't see the governments being too bothered by that. See, again, it's only the private citizens sitting on money that is a problem. Because if private citizens sit on money, they can afford to challenge the status quo because they've got some savings. So also, the bank has warned, the English bank has warned, Bank of England has warned that people could be defrauded. They could be defrauded through cryptocurrencies. I guess that's a bit different from the defrauding that occurs through the inflation that is created through the endless creation of money through central banks. So I guess they're really concerned about you losing monetary value, which is why they want to keep a central bank and keep jigging inflation and money supply to the point where you don't know which way is up economically anymore, and you have the basic direction sense of a hamster in a tumble dryer. Governments, says the bank, would have to address issues of, quote, taxation, money laundering, and the possible use of new payment systems in financing terrorism or other crime. Well, there's a little hobby that governments developed. I mean, they've really had it throughout all of human history, but they really refined it to a fine, dark art in the 20th century, that little hobby called war. And war, in its current form, is completely impossible without fiat currency. And I've done a speech on this in Toronto, Bitcoin versus war, which you can check out. But funding even the war on terror would require more gold than has ever been mined in human history. In other words, you'd run out of money long before you ran out of bullets. And so it's really fascinating that they're concerned about people losing economic value through Bitcoin, so we should give them the power of central banking to maintain that value, which has never happened. The US dollar has lost 98% of its value since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, and they're really concerned that Bitcoin might be used to finance physical aggression, terrorism. Their concern about how fiat currencies are used to finance, say, the war on terror appears to be notably absent. So it's important to recognize that it's a big enough issue that banks are talking about it, and I think that where they get to the, we'll provide a link to this to the conference organizers to share as well. Where they really get into the nitty-gritty, though, the bank acknowledged Bitcoin's disruptive potential by describing the technology underpinning it as, quote, a first attempt at an internet of finance and a genuine innovation that could be used to shake up traditional banking. So basically, now, they say, if Bitcoin use becomes widespread, the Bank of England's levers to manage the economy through interest rates and quantitative easing would no longer work because both the supply and price would be out of its control. Oh boy, wouldn't that be terrible? Governments through central banks, or central banks through governments, whichever way you want to spin that revolving door, would be unable to manage the economy. Remember how stable the economy has been since the introduction of central banking in the 20th century. Remember how stable banking and the economy has been since Nixon uncoupled the US dollar from the gold standard in 1971? It's completely mad. What they don't, when they say manage the economy, what they really mean is manipulate the economy for the special interests of the 0.0001% who seem to control the vast majority of the world's wealth. So the fact that we would be taking out the power to control interest rates and create money from the moneyed classes, I cannot see as anything other than one of the greatest boons that could ever happen to the species at any time throughout history. Now, how big is the financial sector? Well, in a word, very. 20% of America's entire gross domestic product is generated by industries whose main function is to act as a trusted third party. And here I use the word trusted extremely loosely. US bank fees alone generate $250 billion a year. Global payments-related revenues exceed $300 billion a year. Why is that so big? Why is that so enormous? And how big is that really? Well, it's terrifyingly big. So just think of this. So the sum coin is 3.4, get ready for the T, trillion dollars. $3.4 trillion a year. Not since the dawn of time or until the sun goes cold, every single year. How big is that? That's the size of Germany's entire gross domestic product. It's more than half of Japan's gross domestic product, 41% of China's gross domestic product, and far bigger than the United Kingdom. The size of the financial industry in the United States is the size of the entire U.S. gross domestic product as recently as 1963. So big is the key word. Now, of course, payment transaction fees are directly threatened by Bitcoin, but of course, the Bitcoin technology, and in particular the blockchain asset ledger and the protocol, could also challenge fees on deposit fees, foreign exchange fees, escrow, trust management fees, collection fees, etc., etc., etc. It's really, really important to understand how big the behemoth is that Bitcoin is facing. And there will, of course, be efforts made on the part of the financial government complex to keep the technology at bay. Now, my guess is that they don't and they won't. Like if I sort of put on my Dr. Evil hat and imagine if I'm sitting in the enormous satanic chair known as the Federal Reserve Chairman's butt warmer, I would say, well, let's not kill it completely. Let's not kill it outright. Because it's big enough now that people will see what we've done, and it really disturbs the villagers when a body falls from the sky. So they don't want to do that. What they want to do is they want to regulate it. And what that means, and of course they're talking about this in New York with the licensing for Bitcoin exchanges. There was just a sting operation in Florida where 2 men were charged with a variety of crimes because they exchanged Bitcoins personally. One of the fascinating and, I guess, lesser reported aspects of that is that it was Special Agent Ponzi who was involved in this sting operation. So what they're going to try and do is they're just going to try and not take out the revving engine with an airstrike, but just throw little bits of sand in it, little bits of sand in it, little bits of sand in it, until most people find it too difficult and cumbersome to use, and then say, well, it was an interesting idea, just didn't quite work out the way that people wanted. And I think that is the great danger. The first bank or the first government that outlaws it completely, I think, is basically revealing to the world the weakness of their own currency, and that may have negative impacts for them in the long run. But my concern is that if they make it very difficult, not impossible, but if they make it more and more difficult for honest, law-abiding citizens to use Bitcoin, then it will, of course, displace itself into the black market and the gray market. And then, of course, then they'll say, well, you see, we told you it was going to be used for crime. Let's get back to fiat currencies, which is never used for anything destructive. So I think that's an important consideration. So my caution, my advice, my concern is that what I see in the Bitcoin community is quite a bit of optimism, and I would also a little bit of political naivete. The financial sector is the biggest single contributor to politicians, at least in the United States. Obama himself was elected largely because he took so much money from the financial sector. And what did they buy with that money? Well, hundreds of billions of dollars of bailouts and zero prosecution for their admitted crimes. So they are buying themselves governments and all of the associated power that comes with governments. When you can buy a government, you're pretty much a force to be reckoned with. And this is occurring throughout the world. Originally, governments were more powerful than banks, but as the logic of late capitalism democracy continues its unsteady march towards the cliff edge, what's happening is governments stay in power by promising more to their citizens than they're collecting in taxes. They can't do that mathematically, right? If I'm a politician and I come to you and say, you know, vote for me and I'll give you $500, I just need to tax you $1,000 first, then people will get that it's a money-losing proposition. But if they say, I'll give you $500, and then they create that money out of thin air, and the effects then slowly ripple through the economy, and there's not more than one person in 1,000 who can trace 18 months later inflation to fiat currency creation during times of elections, then they can give you the illusion of the government adding value or creating value in the economy. That process is so necessary for politicians to get elected. They need to promise more than they're collecting in taxes, and the only way they can do that is to create money. And then they have to suppress interest rates to avoid the resulting the inflation of the money supply. That process is so far along that I would argue governments are utterly dependent upon the goodwill of central banks, which is why they don't prosecute them, which is why they bribe them with money that they themselves have created, the banks themselves have created. It is an unholy alliance, and it is generally invisible to the majority of citizens in the world. It is a very abstract virus. You know, we generally get our fight and flight mechanism when a saber-toothed tiger jumps out of a cave. But at this point, the predation on the general citizen is so deferred through national debts, is so invisible through inflation, and requires such an oily and abstract and ethereal machination of financial interests and obfuscations, people can't see it. So be careful when you're out there in the Bitcoin world. Talk to lawyers, talk to accountants, make sure you declare things where necessary, make sure you stay on the right side of things. Don't become the equivalent of the severed head of the noble that they put on pikes in the French Revolution. Don't become the example that scares other people away from what I've argued is the most beneficial technology to hit mankind since we first figured out how to make fire. So that's my little intro. I wanted to leave lots of time for questions, should people have any.
Hi, Steph, can you hear me?
I can. How you doing?
Hi. Thanks so much. This was really, really powerful. Again, I wanted to start with a comment before asking my question, because people may be surprised to see a philosopher at a conference for about technology and money. it's often thought that philosophy doesn't have a lot of practical bearing on people's lives. But actually, throughout history, it's been there's a couple of powerful examples where this has been the case. One example is Thales of Miletus, ancient Greek philosopher known as the first mathematician, and he predicted a really good olive harvest for Greece at the time. And in the wintertime, he rented a lot of olive presses, and then in the harvest time, he would rent them out again and make a great profit. And his goal was not the profit, but it was to show to people the value of philosophy on everyday life. And I think you really exemplify this as well, because in early 2011 already, you were talking about the value of Bitcoin, about the power of its technology. And so you helped people thinking about technology, you helped philosophers to see the value of Bitcoin. But now I'd like to turn the question around and ask you, what does Bitcoin mean for the philosopher? Like, how can this new technology that opens up so many possibilities, that allows people to do things without having to ask permission, what does that mean for the person who wants to be good or virtuous? Is it more opportunity to take a stand, to make a difference, to be good, or is it a pitfall? Are there dead ends in that area?
Well, it's a great question. I would say that there are so many examples now of spontaneous self-organization that the idea that we now must automatically assume that society must be organized according to a centrally coercive pyramid of power has completely fallen away. Beforehand, I mean, I'm a voluntarist, which means I don't believe, and I actually morally reject, the justification for state power as a central organizing, quote, organizing paradigm of society. There are so many examples now of spontaneous self-organization that we now have empirical proof of the value of spontaneous self-organization. I mean, just off the top of my head, Wikipedia. I mean, the idea that, well, let's just make a dictionary that anyone can edit. It's like, that will be chaos, it will be madness. No, it actually works very, very well. Linux. I mean, the idea that you're just going to create an operating system because you can't afford to buy one that now runs billions of devices around the world and is continually refined and modified by a spontaneous community is astounding. Bitcoin emerging as technology that spontaneously self-organizes, that patches itself, that updates itself, that can be extended. This power of spontaneous self-organization, which is kind of how our bodies work, right? There's no government that runs my kidney. It spontaneously self-organizes. Life itself is. And seeing this replicated over and over and over again in such incredibly beneficial ways in society has, I think, given us finally, empirical proof of the power of spontaneous self-organization, how human beings work together in cooperative and positive and beneficial ways if the magic phrase laissez-faire, let us be, let us alone, stop pointing guns at us, stop herding us around, stop throwing us into the non-concentration camps of government schools, stop taxing us, stop inflating our currency, stop sending us to war, stop selling off our children for votes. Once we can see how immoral all that is, we take that out and we now have endless examples of what will replace it, which is peaceful, voluntary, positive, spontaneous cooperation and the true organization of voluntary interaction. So I think it's given us an immense empirical tool to prove all the things which were called impossible are now commonplace.
Thanks.
Let's do more applause earlier, Steph, but we were on mute here, so you couldn't hear the audience. You can hear us now, right?
I hope at least some of you were listening in 2011 when I think there were like 4.5 bitcoins rolling around the internet, so I hope that you were listening.
Let's do a few questions from the audience then. What are the questions for Steph?
It's nice to see voluntarism making money for voluntarists.
Hello, my name is Marco. I'm from Rotterdam in Media. A few weeks ago, in August actually, Stefan Molyneux, a film that was a parody on distance to the mysteries. And you call it, this is the woman list. We actually did a Dutch version on that, obviously in this parody, you talk about the hypocrites and the parasites. There are many people here in Holland who think we will never get rid of these people. What do you think?
Never is a dangerous word to say in the annals of human history. We got rid of overt slavery. That wasn't so bad. We managed to ratchet up some equal rights for women. That wasn't so bad. Spanking, corporal punishment for children, which was a worldwide and brutal practice throughout most of human history, began to fall away after the 18th and 19th centuries. Countries in your neck of the woods have banned spanking as a violation of the non-aggression principle. Never say never. If you hold fast to your principles and you are consistent and you are courageous, the most virtuous position will always win. I guarantee you that in history. The only time when evil wins is when good people stand aside. And so if you hold fast to your principles, that spontaneous, voluntary, truly democratic currencies without centralized control is the only way to morally organize the exchange of value in society, because there's no initiation of force in Bitcoin. There is initiation of force in central banking. They counterfeit, you go to jail. You don't use their currency to pay off the imaginary bills called taxation, you go to jail. You try to compete with the central bank, you go to jail. It is a coercive and violent monopoly, as fundamentally immoral as the ownership of slaves, because it is merely the ownership of your time in portions rather than your body in whole. Never doubt that in the long run virtue will triumph, because the moment you do, you falter, and when you falter, you lose.
Next question.
Hello, Stefan. My name is Nick. I love listening to your show, Freedom Radio. And my question is, what can we do to protect Bitcoin from the flaws of government? Of course, we can buy them and use them, that's the first step, but can we do actually as an individual to protect the Bitcoin against government intervention?
That got a bit blurry, but the question, what can we do to protect Bitcoin and its reputation, is that right?
What can we do to protect Bitcoin from government?
Well, the best way to avoid external policing is to self-police, right? Prevention is by far the better part of cure when it comes to immorality. So what happened in Florida, at least according to the police reports, is the police went to Bitcoin enthusiasts, I think it was through Coinbase.com, localbitcoin.com, sorry, and they went and they said, listen, I want to buy some Bitcoins so that I can go and buy some stolen credit card numbers. And the Bitcoin enthusiasts were like, okay. And the police said, would you like to buy some stolen credit card numbers? And they're like, no, but, we'll think about it. And that's not good. And in a free society, that would be a bad thing no matter what. I mean, nobody wants to be on the receiving end of that kind of fraud. So if you self-police, then it's much better than having external agents from the state come in and create all kinds of mess and problems. And so if you know people who are in the Bitcoin community who are up to no good, I think I think it's important to self-police. Go talk to those people. Go see if you can change their mind. Go turn them to a better path. But there's lots of tools out there to both social and technological to ostracize people who are going to do genuine wrong using Bitcoin. And so I'm a big fan of ostracism. It's how societies used to function. If you didn't obey social rules, then people wouldn't have much to do with you. I think that's a fantastic way. It's not violent. It's not a violation of the initiation, the non-initiation of force. So I think that the more that we can focus on self-policing the Bitcoin community, the more we can emerge as a pretty noble and shining example of human cooperation. So because I'm anti-state, that does not mean that I'm pro-immorality, right? I mean, I'm anti-state because I'm anti-immorality. And so if you know people in the Bitcoin community who are tempted by, genuinely nasty stuff, do what you can to intervene, do what you can to have people not deal with these people, and I think that will help the most. Again, I'm not saying it should become your Joe Friday obsession, but if you come across it, I think it's worth doing something about it where you can.
There's room for one more question.
Well, about throwing cents in the Bitcoin machine, what about the role of the media in the US, especially about radio?
Yeah, the role of the media is to sell newspapers and to sell click-throughs and to sell commercial time and commercials. So society is inherently conservative because it has developed in a configuration that serves the needs of those who have the most money. The financial services industry buys huge amounts of advertising and spends a huge amount of money buying services from other companies, and those companies naturally want that to continue. That's why they've invested. That's why they built their railroads too, so they don't want the town to move. It's similar to the way in which negative effects of psychotropic drugs are just never really reported in the media because pharmaceutical companies buy so many ads. So that's natural. This is why they call the technology disruptive. It disrupts existing, carefully grown and maintained economic relationships. So the media is going to be negative towards Bitcoin. You know, as Antonopoulos pointed out recently, the car, when it first was introduced, was dangerous and hitting people and broke down all the time and so on. Well, I would imagine that's because the horse and carriage manufacturers bought a lot of advertising in newspapers, and so the newspapers naturally didn't want to do. Like, some libertarian commenters have a lot of close relationships with people who sell gold, and does that influence their view of Bitcoin? I would imagine it may do. So I think recognize that there's not going to be any help coming from the mainstream media, that the mainstream media is going to be relentless in pointing out all the worst things possible in Bitcoin because they want to protect the value of their existing financial relationships. Also, if they start talking down central banking, they might find themselves with slightly less access to the government officials that hand them over heavily redacted documents which are then passed off as somehow investigative journalism. So there's a huge amount of entrenched economic interest that's going to be negative and hostile towards Bitcoin. The fantastic news is that they hold a declining monopoly on the dissemination of information. At least in America, people's trust in the mainstream media is so low that they're almost trust Congress more. That's about as low as you can get. And so a couple more stakes from the internet into the heart of these vampires, and they'll stop drinking the blood of the young. So let's just keep disseminating the information in as calm and positive and enthusiastic and clear and rational a way as possible. And when the communication, good money drives out bad, bad money drives out good. Good information drives out the propaganda of the mainstream media. So just keep doing what you're doing, keep talking about it, and people will gravitate towards those who have the clearest position. And once they understand the degree to which objectivity in the mainstream media is compromised, if not downright destroyed by existing financial interests, they'll cease taking it seriously and go to those with better information.
Thank you very much, Stefan.
And Tuur, of course, thanks for being online with us today. So I'm going to hang you guys up and talk later.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure chatting with you all. Have a great conference. All the best.